Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our colleagues who are joining us today for our fourth day of our Knowledge for Prevention Symposium. My name is Catherine Bailey-Abity, and I'm the Director of Research and Learning at the Dallaire Institute for Children, Peace and Security. Before we begin today's session, we would like to acknowledge that the Dallaire Institute and Dalhousie University, where we are located, is located on Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. For partners joining us from around the globe, yesterday was Orange Shirt Day here in Canada, and a day to remember the horror caused by the residential school system, a network of boarding schools for Indigenous children across the country. Residential schools systematically tried to oppress, silence, and forcibly assimilate the Indigenous peoples of this country for over a century, leaving unspeakable tragedies in their wake, including a legacy of intergenerational trauma. As we're reflecting today and this week on peace building and the importance of strengthening child protection mechanisms, it is important for us to remember the legacy of colonialization in Canada and around the globe. Colonization continues to greatly impact the lives of children. And thus it's up to us collectively, and it is our collective responsibility to try and end this ongoing prejudice and racism that Indigenous peoples face across the globe. When we talk about prioritizing the rights of children, this includes the rights of our First Peoples. As you are all aware, the focus of today's session will be on the dynamics of recruitment prevention. And let me start by saying a sincere thank you for joining us today. We have colleagues joining in from around the world and colleagues in many sectors, and we're grateful to you for this participation and look forward to continuing discussion on this area of work. Today is sure to be a fascinating discussion with four incredible change makers sharing their experiences and innovative solutions to protect children. It is well documented that the use of children as soldiers remains a pervasive and growing problem in most modern conflicts. Children are also living in more complex and fragile contexts. In 2017, our colleagues at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo estimated there is 1.8 billion children living in conflict-affected countries, which amounts to over 80% of all children. Even more concerning is that 420 million children were estimated to be living within less than 50 kilometers where fighting was occurring. Many of these children remain in urgent need of protection. It should also be noted that despite common narratives on who is a child soldier, the phenomenon of the recruitment of children into armed conflict and violence is not isolated to one part of the globe. It is a global problem that requires a global solution. The physical, psychological, and social impacts of conflict on children are far-reaching, particularly for those recruited and used as soldiers. These impacts are only heightened by the changing nature of war, as armed groups continue to find new tactics to recruit and use children in violence. If in the past children were involved in conflict despite their age, they are now being recruited because of their age as a strategic and tactical innovation. According to the 2019 UN Secretary General's report on children in armed conflict, there are 7 national armies and 56 armed groups operating in 14 countries that continue to recruit and use children as soldiers, both boys and girls, despite international law that clearly recognizes that children have no place in violence and armed conflict. The use of children as soldiers persists among many non-state armed groups. The recruitment of children as soldiers has long-term impacts on both the individual child and on the broader communities due to an array of complex and intersecting factors, including the disruption of school, the consequences and long-term nature of trauma, and the normalization of violence. The recruitment and use of children as soldiers also has a long-term impact on the security sector actors who are exposed to potentially morally injurious events. Thus, in order to break the endemic cycles of violence and achieve peace and security globally, the prevention of recruitment and the protection of children must be prioritized by all actors at all levels of operation, from grassroots, community-based programming to the international political sphere. And as we heard highlighted by one of our extraordinary youth speakers yesterday, Vasilika Joan Ledu, engaging young people in peace processes is necessary for sustainable peace. It is from this point where we will begin our discussion today. I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, Michel Chikwanine, who is an author and human rights activist. A former child soldier, Michel has already endured and overcome unimaginable pain and struggle. His passion and belief in the possibility for change makes him a truly remarkable individual and humanitarian. Born in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Michel grew up amid the terror of the Great War of Africa. Much of Michel's childhood was affected by the war, which claimed over 3.8 million people, and his father included. Forced to leave his home as a refugee at age 11, Michel has since traveled to many African countries, witnessing and researching firsthand the challenges facing the continent, but also the beauty of the communities and the people who live there. Today, Michel is a United Nations Fellow for People of African Descent, an accomplished motivational speaker on leadership and facilitator, and an award-winning author of a children's book entitled Child Soldier: How Boys and Girls Are Used in War. Addressing audiences across the world, he has spoken to over 500,000 people. From 2007 to 2009, he was Oprah's O Ambassadors Roots of Action Tour participant, where he coordinated and facilitated a speaking tour, as well as leadership workshops, which largely reached students at resource-poor schools. He has worked on various global initiatives with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Martin Sheen, and Magic Johnson, including being on the advisory board of the Delaire Institute, and we're very grateful for your continued support, Michel. So we're honored to have you join us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. Bonjour, mesdames, messieurs. I am humbled by this opportunity to share this platform with such distinguished panelists and speakers and incredible peacemakers. The stories and the lessons being told across this symposium over the last couple of days about the need to prevent and protect children from being abused through policy are stories that I not only relate to, but they're stories that I have lived myself. When I was 5 years old, I was abducted to be a child soldier. I remember very vividly because it was at the end of the day and I was playing football, it's what's called on the continent and in North America, soccer. I was playing with my friends, and as we're playing, an army truck came racing down the field towards the field, and the soldiers came out of the truck, came racing towards the kids, and they were yelling at us. They put us into a truck and they took us to their camp after driving for a long few hours on a bumpy road. I remember feeling so terrified. I remember not knowing, first of all, what was happening, what was going on. And for 2 weeks, I was trained to be a soldier. I was drugged, I was manipulated, and I was forced to kill my best friend as an initiation process into this army. After weeks of training, we were taken to a village that had food and gun supplies that we were told we needed to keep us alive. So we attacked this village. And it was during that attack where I mustered up enough courage to escape. And by some miracle, I managed to reach a town called Butembo. And in Butembo, I ended up meeting a man named a man in a store that took me back to where my father and my family was. And for some reason, I am here today. And as sad as my story is, it makes me even more sad and sometimes even angry to know that there are still thousands of children, hundreds of thousands of children who are going through this experience, and some more who are continuing to be recruited. And what's even more sad is that if I had never escaped, that today I'd be counted as one of the numbers of these children who are continuing into this sad cycle that's happening around our world. And despite the progress that we've made over the last few years on this issue specifically, especially on the work that we've done on the Vancouver Principles, it seems that the scale and intensity of today's conflicts is stretching our capacity to protect children to its limits. In war zones such as Congo, Syria, South Sudan, Iraq, and Yemen, we are witnessing a deeply troubling breakdown in humanity and a decreasing respect for human life and dignity. Children are being placed at the heart of conflict and directly targeted, with their homes and their schools being destroyed, their food and water supplies being deliberately cut off. Even in countries like Colombia, where we had made such amazing progress over the last few years, children are now being thrusted back into the armed conflicts and recruited by leaders who are taking advantage of the unstable economy and high rates of unemployment. Yet another impact of COVID-19. The most effective way for me to protect children is by preventing and resolving conflict and sustaining peace. This must be our priority. But yet it seems like every few years, we are right back where we started. Peace must always be our priority. Yet what does it say when collectively as a world, we spend $1.8 trillion on our militaries? What does it say when the United Nations requests record amounts to deal with the global unprecedented needs and the biggest donors reduce their spending? Last year, the United States reduced its spending by 423 million, Germany by 367 million, the UK by 271 million. So it begs me to ask, are we really interested in peace and preventing their abuses on children? Or are we okay with meeting here again in a few years, asking the same questions once the next tragedy hits? The international community, in my opinion, has to find better ways to leverage influence on parties and in conflict and to illustrate the enormous costs of war, both on the future of children and on their communities, but also our collective security. We need to first tell the truth that war has become and has always been profitable. And so the international community needs to be firm and clear in illustrating the enormous cost of those profits and find ways to make it less profitable for those funding, selling weapons, and meddling in other countries. Not just the ones who are on the ground fighting. As a Congolese, I cannot emphasize enough how important and serious this statement is. Young people have told us over and over again, nothing about us without us. So let us heed that call. When peace processes begin, we must systemically include child protection measures from the outset and include the voices of children and youth in the negotiations. Ask them what they need to heal. What is it that they need to heal? What is it that they need to move forward? What is it that they need to sustain peace in their own communities? When we're planning humanitarian responses to COVID-19 or other disasters, let us collaborate with children and youth to find the solutions that they need in their own communities. Let us make our politicians understand that in order to sustain peace in our countries, we must prioritize the needs of children and their communities over the interests of big industry, and let's hold them accountable when they are elected. Lastly, we have to be prepared to invest in peace for the long term. It's not an easy sell, but it is necessary. I heard a quote the other day that said, "Don't tell me about your priorities, show me your budget." Even when the cameras are gone and children and armed conflict is no longer the conflict du jour, we have to stay committed to making this world a better place for children, or else you risk coming back here again in 10 years and you'll be speaking to another Michel, asking him the same exact questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michel, for your very important points and for really calling attention to the reality that the funding and where we prioritize our funding truly says a lot about where our priorities really are in our action. And I appreciate that candor and that importance, being focused on that. Thank you also for sharing your personal experience with us so that we can learn and rally together to create much different futures moving forward for children. So sincere thanks and look forward to the continued discussions with you. In relation to funding priorities, I do want to acknowledge the Knowledge for Prevention project, which again is focused on early warning and prevention, is generously funded by Bruce McKean. So someone who is demonstrating children as a priority in action. So Bruce, we're very grateful to your continued support. Next, I would like to introduce Abdikarim Hassan, who is the Protection Program Manager at the Elman Peace Center in Mogadishu, Somalia. In his role, Abdikarim oversees the center's work with children associated with armed forces and groups to effectively facilitate processes of demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration of the Elman Peace's beneficiaries into civilian life. His responsibilities also include the coordination with law enforcement agencies and other child protection stakeholders. With over 5 years of practitioner experience, an LLM graduate from Loyola University Chicago School of Law, Abdikarim is an internationally recognized expert for community-based approaches to reintegration in the context of armed conflict, where no peace agreement has yet been concluded. Abdikarim is currently pursuing postgraduate research on the legal landscape affecting DDR processes and lectures on human rights law at different universities in Somalia. Before I turn the floor over to Abdikarim, I would like to recognize Abdikarim as one of our 5 incredible youth speakers we have participating in this year's symposium. We're grateful that you could be here with us today to share your experiences and insights working in the front lines of child protection in Mogadishu. So Abdikarim, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'd like to first of all take this opportunity to thank the Institute and everyone for giving me this incredible opportunity to speak on behalf of the children of Somalia that have endured long conflict and as a result have been affected by the endemic conflict that has been happening in Somalia. Somalia, I think everybody knows its context and dilemma. Somalia has been passing through different phases of conflict, and at the center of this conflict has been children who have been affected enormously. When it comes to the recruitment and use of children, I think Somalia is at the top list when it comes to the use of children in armed conflict. And ever since the dynamics of the conflict in Somalia has changed from warlords to violent extremism, children have continuously been impacted as such. The consequences of armed conflict on children is endless and it can't be quantified or measured. We have, as a change maker who works with the children day and night, I usually see children who tell you they haven't slept for days simply because of the traumas they have witnessed or they have been forced to impart. As my other panelist, Mr. Michel, has personally shared his experience, the children do face enormous consequences due to conflict, and it's the priority of us as grassroots change makers to take up the challenge of ensuring children are not in any way recruited. Now, there's a high degree of complexity around recruitment of children into armed groups because there's no interdependence between the various components of the environment, especially in terms of recruitment and use that's connected to economic and other issues. Here in Somalia, the socio-economic factors such as poverty and education, the legal and policy issues that hamper family dynamics, and quite a lot abuse, such as sexual abuse and impunity are at the top reasons why most recruitment cells find ways to at least recruit children. Children see sometimes, particularly in Somalia, see joining to these groups as a means of survival, because we have endemic poverty and you know, the push and pull factors of such reasons stay visible, and they know recruitment cells do understand very well how to manipulate the system and also the families. Now, in terms of prevention, strengthening life skills and leadership potentials, especially girls and boys, as Elman, we focus topics on dealing with emotions and relationship with peers and others in terms of conflict and prevention. It's also our prevention policy is strengthening the skills of parents and caregivers to care for and protect their children through economic empowerment, which has been ongoing since 1991, post the conflict civil war in Somalia. I think also strengthening the capacity of local communities, because local communities and the child protection system play a very critical role in our programming, and that's where the center of recruitment of children mostly happen, and they happen behind curtains, and it's important that we strengthen the community structures and system so that they are better placed to coordinate and respond to recruitment prevention. Community mobilization and awareness raising is also integral in terms of preventing, and they facilitate and initiate awareness raising on schools and places that are controlled by the government, because we have places that are hard to reach, and due to security reasons, it's hard to see what's happening with the children in that context. To prevent children, also our programs center on educating children across schools, across centers, on prevention and family separation and early identification, because a child who is separated from his family has no one to protect, and at this juncture, that where such recruitment cells take advantage of such vulnerability. Reunification programs are quite strengthened, working with the stakeholders that are very critical, such as other civil society organizations, the community, to at least better unify the child with his parent. A viable alternative to join armed forces is also very important in this context, as where we work with a very, very large youth. Almost 80% of Somali's populations are under 18s or under 25. In this context, it's very important to build viable opportunities for such young generation, where there's no social amenities, social institution, credible government institution that are able to provide the necessary amenities that children need, such as survival, education, skills. Then it's important for civil society as us to provide such programs so that children are not left in a vacuum to mend for themselves. Further, we build resilient communities, building resilience of children also affected by armed conflict, by strengthening the individuals and the community's inner and external resources. Education and vocational training is important for them so that at least they can have economic empowerment towards their reintegration. Working closely with stakeholders such as the national security architect, we usually receive handovers as per the policy with the UN Children's Agency. Standard operating procedure has been put in place to at least continuously reintegrate children who are affected by armed conflict. And it is this juncture that it's important to see violence on children children should be seen as a victim rather than perpetrators of violence. And building the resilience, we build a positive relationship with children and adults, the ability to monitor and regulate emotions, because emotions sometimes do render children to take extreme effect, because seeing their family members being killed in front of them, some of them force them to at least retaliate, and in such cases they are forced to join such armed groups which commit atrocities. Opportunity to develop skills and for adapting to the environment is also very important, and building self-efficacy and facilitating faith and hope in this post-conflict environment remains necessary. I'd like to conclude by saying that the legal policy context remains important to prevent children from recruitment, but at the same time, holding accountable those people who are perpetrating this violence should be a priority to all stakeholders, and empowering civil society organizations who work at the grassroots to help find pathways to peace through enabling children to at least take and talk about their rights in such an important forum such as the ones that we are now, and enable them to at least have a proper pathways to integration. Challenges remain in context of environment or post-conflict environment to at least identify who is a child remains a big problem, where there's no birth certificate registration of children who are born, babies who are born, then it becomes an impairment to identify what or who is a child in this context. Moving on, with regards to issues to do with the lack of viable birth certificates, I think the international community can partner with the UNICEF and other children agencies to address the issues that are rampant. And peacekeeping remains very important, but contextualizing and focusing on hard security sometimes is not a solution, and it remains a revolving door where no solutions are seen. Speaking of that context, Somalia had peacekeeping missions for the last 10 years or so, and still there is no any viable solution to peace that's seen, because often the international community focuses on hard security and fighting the extremist groups rather than seeing face to face and dialoguing and through a peaceful lens is often missed out. Thank you so much, and I'm out.
Thank you, Abdikarim, for that wonderful presentation. You've touched on so many points, as Michel has before you, around the importance of listening to children, the importance of understanding the significant impacts of conflict, and most importantly, if I may say, the importance of prevention. And this is the genesis of this particular conversation, is to really see how we can do prevention work better. And you've raised really important points for us to further consider, and I look forward to speaking with you in the Q&A. And you've actually perfectly lined up for our next speaker when you're talking about the importance of community resilience and having social structures in place to protect children with more strength and more solidarity. So on that note, I'm very pleased to introduce our next speaker, who is a great collaborator with the Dallaire Institute, Serge Stroobants. Serge is the Director of Europe and the MENA region at the Institute for Economics and Peace. His academic specialization is in political science, international relations, security and defense, global risk analysis, foresight, and crisis management. He has served at all levels of operational command and also at the strategic level at NATO HQ as the military assistant to the Belgian military representative to the NATO Military Committee. Serge deployed to the Balkans for an aggregated period of more than 2 years and has served in multiple deployments. He participated in a NATO response force and an EU battle group training, preparation and standby phase. Serge has been awarded several National Order decorations, the NATO Medal, and the Medal of Honor of the German Armed Forces. He is a visiting professor at the Vesalius College in Brussels, the Riga Graduate School of Law, and the University in Barcelona, teaching courses on peace and security and on global terrorism and radicalization. So welcome, Serge, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon from Brussels, and thank you very much to the Dallaire Institute to host me today. It's really an honor to be on this panel, and I've been very humbled by the presentations by my two colleagues, Michel and Abdikarim, on this panel. And I'm really, really proud that we were able to have people from the field that I've experienced firsthand, that I still experience today, what child recruitment is and what child violence with children may look like. So I'm really humbled to be here, and I'm really proud also to sit next to these two incredible men on this panel. So first, a few words about the Institute for Economics and Peace. So we are a global think tank dedicated to shifting the way the world thinks about peace. Our goal is to be able to define and conceptualize peace, and then operationalize it by establishing metrics to measure peace. In our work, we produce different indices that identify levels of peace in a country, calculate the economic cost of violence, and maybe a first remark to something Michel said. The very conservative estimate for the cost of violence annually is more than 14 trillion US dollars. So if you would just take 1% of this, 1% of this sum of money represents about the global annual budget for overseas aid development. So if we could just reduce by a little bit the cost of violence, we could do, I would say, we produce wonders in a lot of countries. And we also measure countries' resilience to external shocks and conflict. So we feature Global Peace Index, Positive Peace Index. We also have a Global Terrorism Index that is looking at, I would say, the impact of terrorism. And we just released this September, so about 3 weeks ago, our inaugural ecological threat register that explores the connections between ecological threats, resilience, and peace. So we approach peace as negative peace. That's what we do for the Global Peace Index, where we look at the absence of violence or the fear of violence, but we also, and especially focused on positive peace, which is the systemic approach to peace that are the attitudes, the institutions and structures, creating and sustaining peaceful societies, but also leading to the benefits that are linked with a more peaceful situation. Those benefits are economic, social, in governance, but also ecological. So I had a look at the links between our indices and also the data from the Dallaire Institute about child recruitment. You can identify several key countries with a higher prevalence of recruitment of child soldiers. Countries to focus on include the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, Sudan and South Sudan, Somalia, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and Rwanda. 4 of these countries are amongst the 5 least peaceful countries on the 2020 Global Peace Index. These countries are South Sudan, Yemen, Syria, and Iraq. When we calculate the economic cost of violence, we measure the impact of violence on a country's economy as a percentage of a country's GDP. These same countries with active recruitment and use of child soldiers also have some of the largest proportional economic cost of violence. So this means, for example, for Syria, 60% of the GDP is dedicated to violence. South Sudan, 57%, Somalia, 38%, Iraq, 26%. And this huge amount of money is dedicated to peace and cannot be invested in all the other aspects. And I would say to face all the other threats that those countries are engaging with. And I'm talking about, of course, the socio-economic tissue, but also improved governance and also investment in, I would say, the effects of climate change or the effects of ecological threats. So when we look at those countries in the Global Terrorism Index, so when we look at the impact of terrorism in those countries, we see that Iraq, number 2 on the list, of 163 countries, Syria number 4, Somalia number 6, Yemen number 8, DRC number 10, Sudan number 17. So all those countries that we are looking at are clearly within the top 20 of the Global Terrorism Index also. When we look at the ecological threat register, we see that all of the countries of interest here were found to be at high or medium exposure to multiple ecological threats. The Ecological Threat Register has found that there are 3 hotspots regions that are at high risk for ecological threats and have low levels of resilience. These 3 regions are the Sahel region through the Horn of Africa, so really going from Mauritania down to Somalia, and I would say over to Yemen. Another belt, southern part of Africa, reaching from Angola down to Mozambique and Madagascar, and a third one really reaching from Syria over to Afghanistan, Pakistan through South Asia. When we look more closely, we see that countries like DRC or Somalia are among the countries that have the least access to drinking water services. Water scarcity is one of the areas, I would say, in the ETR, in the Ecological Threat Register. The DRC, Yemen, Syria, and Iraq are all among the countries most at risk of food insecurity. So all this connection illustrates several important points. There is an interplay of factors in these identified countries that enable high rates of child recruitment. These countries do not have what we call negative peace. So there is a high levels of violence and there is a high levels of fear of violence. These countries also do not have high levels of positive peace. So we clearly see a discrepancy there between the impact of violence or even the impact of ecological threat register and the level of resilience that those countries are able to develop to cope with the impact of those threats. These countries, or many of those countries, are also showing high levels of resource scarcity, like food insecurity or water stress, combined with low resilience or ecological threats. This trend is now becoming more and more pronounced, and we really look at, I would say, an aggravated situation in the next 30 years, especially when you combine those scarcity or stress factors to an emerging, I would say, an exploding population growth. And we also see that most of the countries that we see at risk for child recruitment are also within the hotspots for ecological threats. And I would say that we are expecting from those regions, from those countries, potential systemic collapse, or at least collapse of the societal system, and a potential for a large portion or a large number of people to be displaced. We have identified 32 countries in the 3 hotspots of the ecological threat register, and more than 1.2 billion people that are at risk of being forced to move. I think it's also important to look at the greater systemic environment of these countries to understand how child recruitment and the use of child soldiers is able to thrive. While children are abducted, and Michel really explained it in a very, I would say, raw way, but that's the reality of abduction of children in conflict zone, and they are forced into armed conflict. Those children are forced into armed conflict. It is also more often that circumstances, conditions lead children into a situation where they feel also that they have little choice or agency but to join a militarized faction. So we really see a double approach there. So really forced enrollment, but also, I would say, forced enrollment because of the system in which those children have to grow up and have to live. So we must take a more structured approach to consider the conditions enabling this environment in order to better tackle child recruitment also. And what we see there is that those countries have low levels of positive peace, active conflict, and violence that is costly for these 3 countries. And you can add also more of those strategic factors like ecological threats that are reinforcing and aggravating these 3 main opportunities, or at least these three main threats. So we also see that children and youth are especially susceptible, vulnerable, and receptive to recruitment because of lack of opportunities, because of poverty, because of food and water insecurity, inability to access social and human capital, and also non-robust education and institutions. The prospect of working as a child soldier can also seem more desirable as it offers more security or a chance to escape conditions of poverty. It is often the only survival strategy available to children. From my experience at the Institute for Economics and Peace, I have been able to train young Libyans, really Libyan youth, into the principles of positive peace. And one of the most appalling discussions that I had with those youth were, I would say, a couple of young men coming from the city of Sirte in Libya, who explained to me that they really applauded the Islamic State when it took over the city, because they had been living for more than 7 years, so I would say their entire youth, into a conflict zone, full anarchy and full insecurity. And so they preferred to live under the crazy rule of the Islamic State rather than to live longer in an insecure, anarchic world, basically a system collapsed society. And I think this really blew my mind when they said that to me. I had another type of discussion about the same issue with full communities in Somalia. I think Abdikarim might also confirm this, where I would say entire communities prefer the rule of Al-Shabaab rather than no rule at all, insecurity and lack of governance. So now we want to talk about positive peace, and I'm going to close with this. This is where the Institute for Economics and Peace comes in and brings in, I would say, crucial structuring tool to help countries focus on building resilience, building the key institutions that are fostering a more peaceful and more prosperous society. So when countries have positive peace, they have higher per capita income, they have better ecological performance, they have better measures of well-being and happiness, and they, I would say, structurally are building up resilience and able to cope with all those threats that are posed to societies. So we analyze positive peace through 25,000 economic and social progress indicators based on 8 factors, also called the pillars of peace. And I will give some examples of what could be done in the face of child recruitment when you use those pillars of positive peace. For example, the first one, well-functioning government. Well, let's focus on the rule of law. Let's focus on government effectiveness. Let's improve stability and high quality civil services. A sound business environment. So let's focus on competitive markets, on productivity, low levels of corruption, high levels of human capital, focusing on increased social capital, youth development, secondary school and higher level education rates also, free flow of information, good relations with the neighbors where we focus on lower levels of organized international conflict and hostility to foreigners. Good relations improves and supports foreign direct investment, but also human capital flows. Equitable distribution of resources where we could try to close the poverty gap, but also acceptance of the rights of others, focusing on gender, human rights and freedoms. So I would say I would leave it there at the moment because I think I spoke for the time that was allocated to me, but I'm really looking forward to engage in the Q&A and try to explain a bit more how positive peace is creating more resilient societies and is basically erasing the opportunity to recruit children, or is creating a better environment in which children can just grow up, but also take with them into their future and also for future generations, this idea of a more peaceful environment, of a stronger environment and a more resilient environment to live in. So thank you again for giving the Institute for Economics and Peace the opportunity to talk today alongside, I would say, 2 incredible colleagues. And thank you again for a really amazing collaboration with the Dallaire Institute.
Thank you very much, Serge, for that great overview. You've provided a systemic foundation for us to think about vulnerable criteria and environments where children are being exploited for the purpose of violence and armed conflict. And it really helps to set the foundation that Michel and Abdikarim have been speaking about from their personal experience engaged in armed conflict and as a practitioner working to prevent future escalations of conflict. So thank you very much. And I also look forward to our discussions about positive peace and community resilience in the Q&A. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Shelly Whitman, who is the Executive Director of the Delaire Institute for Children, Peace and Security. Shelly took up the post of the Executive Director 10 years ago and has been at the lead of the growth and expansion of this organization for that duration of time, at which time she has been involved in signing MOUs with 4 countries, leads our international team, which is based in Canada, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Democratic Republic of Congo, and South Sudan. She's been instrumental in creating a number of international agreements and policies on the protection of children, and particularly helped co-author the Vancouver Principles on Peacekeeping and the Prevention of Recruitment and Use of Child Soldiers with the Government of Canada. As the Intact Insurance Senior Fellow and a recognized subject matter expert, Shelly is regularly called upon to speak to global forums and provide media commentary on the issues of children being used in violence. She has been a member of the Paris Principles Steering Group since 2016 and a member of the National Expert Committee on Countering Radicalization to Violence since it was founded in early 2019. Prior to her work at the Dallaire Institute, Shelly worked as the head of research on the Inter-Congolese Dialogue from 2000 to 2002 under the direction of former Botswana President Sir Michel. Previous to this post, she was a research consultant at UNICEF in New York and worked under the direction of Ambassador Stephen Lewis on the Rwanda Genocide Report. So Shelly, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you to all of you who are joining us today, to our supporters, and all of you who continue to log in each day. I want to also take this opportunity to thank my fellow panelists who are with me today. It's an extreme pleasure to share the opportunity to talk about something that has been at the core of the Dallaire Institute, preventing the recruitment and use of children in conflict and in violence, but also something that myself, that I've been deeply involved in as a researcher even prior to this. So let me start by saying that I'm thrilled to be here with the three fellow panelists, Michel, Abdikarim, and Serge. I have a lot of respect for all of the wonderful work that you're all doing in your respective contexts and organizations, as well as the individuals that you are. I want to also recognize that Michel has been a valued member of our organization's International Advisory Board, and I am so grateful for him to have joined us today. He is a dear friend and also a change maker for the world and speaks truth to power. I have only recently met Abdikarim, and I'm really grateful to have been introduced to him. The Dallaire Institute has long been connected with the Elman Peace Center in Mogadishu through such colleagues as Musa Bao, who has been an incredible colleague of ours and a child protection advisor that has lived and worked in Somalia. This is an area of the world where our institute has focused a lot of security sector training and approaches over the past at least 5 years. And the wonderful collaboration with so many Somali partners and individuals is critical to the success of our work. I also had the pleasure to meet Serge last year at our first Knowledge for Prevention Symposium in Oslo. I was deeply impressed to hear Serge speak on positive peace, have often referenced and followed IEP's work, and also to note something of interest that Serge had experience as a peacekeeper. And this speaks to the heart of the work of the Dallaire Institute, thinking through the multiple approaches to addressing these issues. So as the executive director of the Dallaire Institute for Children, Peace and Security, our focus has been on finding creative and collaborative solutions that are also tangible to prevent the recruitment and use of children in violence, because it's central to sustainable approaches to build peace and security. And I want to reflect on Michel's very point. He is absolutely right. For too long, too many people have talked. For too long, too many people have put money into the wrong areas. For too long, too many organizations have continued to feel that their role is one in which normative frameworks are enough. At the Dallaire Institute for Children, Peace and Security, what we want to focus on is how do we take those normative frameworks and put it into action. I can recall being in the Democratic Republic of Congo earlier on in my career. Having worked on the peace process in the DRC under the former president of Botswana, Sir Ketumile Masiri, that was an opportunity for me to have my first experience in encountering children who were being recruited and used. For me, I recognized that this was a situation that no child should ever have to be in. And I recognized that we needed to do something better. As a result, my getting involved with General Delaire and his work on what was then the Child Soldiers Initiative was central to my hopes that we could find better means to address this issue. And his tangible, practical, lived experience, but from another viewpoint, was one that I deeply appreciated. So as my fellow panelists have aptly noted, the impacts of violence on children affected by armed conflict, and particularly those recruited and used as soldiers, are extensive. But such impacts are not just substantial for the children involved. They are also effects that have deep-rooted impacts on those who are in communities, those who survive the conflicts, and they also are central to underlying societal breaking of fabrics of communities. For far too often, it seems that we're reacting to situations where children have already been recruited and used as soldiers. It is costly to wait until after the fact. Much money has been spent on things such as disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration processes. And although those processes cannot be understated in terms of their importance, the global community completely misses opportunities to prevent the recruitment and use of children at its earliest instances. By shifting our focus to prevention, we have an opportunity to not only better protect children from participating in warfare, but also to protect communities and the traumas that are associated with children's involvement in armed conflict. In the long-term care, it is necessary to implement to not only help rehabilitate them in post-conflict settings, but those that have been affected by the atrocities, and that also includes the peacekeepers. Thus, prevention is critical. It's a critical investment in creating the conditions for lasting and sustainable peace. At the Dallaire Institute, we believe that by broadening the international peace and security agenda to focus on the prevention of recruitment of children, the global community has the opportunity to better address and prevent conflicts from escalating and turning into things such as mass atrocities and genocide. We have to stop this destabilizing impact that it has. It has been shown that conflicts where children are used as soldiers not only have a tendency to last longer, but they also have a greater likelihood of recurrence in the future. If we look at some of the references that Serge gave, such as Syria, the implications for generations to come of the conflict that has ensued over the last 15 years is one that we will all feel for many generations. Our efforts have been focused on issues related to supply, and it's important for us to understand the vulnerabilities that lead to children's involvement in armed groups and gangs and forces. I'm not denying that that is important. It is. We need to understand all of those dynamics. But at the Dallaire Institute, we would argue not enough has been done on how we address the demand for the recruitment and use of children. Why aren't we doing more to ensure that adults and the recruiters no longer see it as an option to use children in this way? Until we address both the supply and the demand side of the equation, we will fail to come up with comprehensive and actionable solutions. Thus, prevention work must happen at both a macro level and in terms of thinking of this in terms of reducing insecurity. How can we also contribute to effective conflict resolution, to addressing wider issues of inequality, to strengthening national protection systems, and at the micro level by strengthening community-based child protection, access to education, intergenerational dialogue, social and norm change, parenting skills, psychosocial support, and livelihoods. As part of this approach, we must continue to recognize and better understand the indicators, yes, that underlie the protection and needs for children, both domestically and globally, and how these conditions for greater child protection also connect to the indicators that measure a nation's level of peacefulness and social stability, much like Serge referenced from IEP. Discussions around conflict prevention can no longer be isolated from global thinking around child protection and recruitment prevention. So to all of you who vote and have an opportunity to vote for your leaders, as well as for those who represent us at major organizations like the African Union, the United Nations, NATO, etc., please know that they, our leaders, have a responsibility to put at the very forefront of all of their decisions the needs and the protection of children as central to any meaningful approaches to achieve peace and stability. These areas are very complex complex, and we have got to start to recognize the interlinked elements. We have to see the links between violations of child trafficking, child labor, sexual violence. Radicalization to extreme violence also has to be understood if we are really going to get to effective prevention, to be able to harness global frameworks and new approaches to prevent. From our perspective at the Dallaire Institute, we employ a children's rights upfront approach to inform our prevention work, in which we seek to elevate children's well-being higher up on the international peace and security agenda, both in terms of making it a priority for all, as well as by ensuring children and youth get to participate in peace processes that impact their future. We ask you all to put on the lens of children. See the world through children's eyes, see it through the eyes of your children, see it through the eyes of the grandchildren that you may never get to see. Recruitment, prevention, and the prioritization of children within the peace and security agenda goes beyond children's rights being promoted. It's about breaking generational cycles of violence and creating the conditions for lasting peace. For far too long, I've been in situations where you are negotiating with those who are now government leaders, who have been impacted directly by the effects of armed conflict. Those who didn't have access to growing up in safety and security, or who had been educated in violence. How can we ever expect to get to a world where we have sustainable peace and security when some of the very people that we are dealing with have themselves many wounds to heal from? Through the inclusion of children and young people in peace-building efforts, we hope that they will become the agents of change, the agents such as Abdikarim and Michel. We hope that we will empower communities and groups such as women's groups, like those we heard from yesterday at the symposium, to help us in recognizing and shaping the direction of their nation and in building more inclusive societies and a better world. It has been referenced throughout the week that children are not born with hatred in their hearts. This is a learned trait and a taught behavior. Thus, by incorporating the perspectives of children into broader peace-building models, we are providing a space for fresh perspectives that have not been tainted by years of political or social divisions. In 2017, we worked with the Canadian government to create the Vancouver Principles. And our hope was that by preventing violence against children, we would have some concerted efforts to move towards transformational action, where changes occur within broader institutions, structures, and norms. It is from this perspective of normative shifts that we operate. Our security sector training is based on these very elements. For context, the first point of outside contact for many children in armed conflict, including children who are recruited and used as soldiers, will often be military and police personnel. Therefore, it is essential that we positively empower the security sector personnel to be agents of change, to be able to interrupt the cycle of recruitment and use of children in violence, and that through their actions, they're promoting the prevention and not advocating for more anger and difficulties that lead to more children wanting to take up arms. As a starting point, security sector actors have to be prepared for the possibility of encountering children who are being recruited and used. This also means that they are needing to have to juggle very ethical and moral considerations on how to perceive a child in a moment's notice in which it is their life or the life of the child. We have to recognize that this moral injury must also stop. It is possible that military and police can change their attitudes and behaviors around the world also and have an impact as a force for good. These challenging sets of circumstances take time to understand and unpack. on whether to view the child as a soldier or as a victim of warfare. This is a luxury that most will never have in the context of armed conflict, leaving them unprepared and likely to under or overreact to the context, and yet for years later question any decisions that they took. Effective prevention does require us addressing the security sector side of the equation. It means equipping our security sector personnel for encounters and potential interventions with children in armed conflict, to identify and counter-react to recruitment tactics to be able to prevent, to recognize and respond to high-risk recruitment areas, to support the escape of children from armed groups and forces, and to protect those who have escaped. And not to underestimate the gender dynamics, to understand those gender dynamics and how it's critical to understanding the recruitment and use of children also. All of these elements are extremely important to be coupled with all of the community efforts as well. Strategic complementarity in this context is important, as an exchange of information, a sharing of resources and coordination or co-implementation of programs in order to establish collaboration and achieve an agreed upon strategic objective. But in this case, we're asking for it to be done in the name of preventing the recruitment and use of children as soldiers. Such an approach creates opportunities for those who would not typically collaborate or wouldn't have any trust, such as those who are working in missions, those who are non-governmental actors, those who are in the security sector, those who may be civilians or government actors. To do so requires a need for us to understand how we build momentum and dialogue towards peace and security. This is at the heart of what the Dallaire Institute has been achieving over the last 10 years, is the need to build relationships, to build trust, because without that, we won't make change. We have to address old development practices that do not work. Building that sustainable approach means listening to our partners, listening to those who have been impacted, listening to communities. And on the security sector side, we are seeing change. As I mentioned, the Vancouver Principles. I can also point to 2017, where we worked with the Canadian Armed Forces, who adopted a joint doctrine note on child soldiers, the first of its kind, and in which Canada began to start down a road to transform itself from a nation that had an ad hoc policy on engagement with children who recruited and used as soldiers, to the first NATO member with a doctrinal document on the issue. We have also worked closely with governments such as Sierra Leone and their forces, both police and military, a country which understands where the recruitment and use of children has been pervasive and widespread and has lasting impacts on generations to come. We are very grateful for the men and women we've worked with in Sierra Leone and the fact that we still see them as our critical change makers on the continent and globally. Today, Sierra Leone has created policies and practices that aim to ensure children are never again recruited and used as soldiers. And we continue this in countries such as Rwanda with the creation of the African Center of Excellence. We hope that this will be a beacon of light for the entire continent to help empower at the African Union and to show that there are approaches that can be driven locally as well. I would like to take a few moments for a couple of remarks to sum up some of the key points that I would like everyone to remember, is that ultimately children's involvement in violence remains a prominent and pervasive element of most modern conflict. Today, we are witnessing places such as Cameroon, where we are seeing the early warning indicators of the recruitment and use of children and the silence that accompanies such atrocities. Our failure to reduce the involvement of children in armed conflict today will only create more leaders that have been educated in violence for tomorrow. As such, effective prevention has to be a priority for the global peace and security agenda. We must see conflict through the lens of the children who are impacted and used to perpetrate violence in some instances, as this is critical to breaking endemic cycles of violence and generational warfare. And once again, I want to thank all of our panelists here and looking forward to our discussion ahead. Lastly, let us not lose hope. We can't be pessimistic. There's too much at stake. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Shelly, for those powerful words and for acknowledging the many players and actors that are required for us to move solutions forward in a sustainable way. And talking from the perspective of the security sector is so important, and I appreciate that you're raising that for this discussion. Also acknowledging the tactics and the environments for recruitment are changing, and so our prevention efforts need to change. And so I'm looking forward to our discussion with all of our panelists to explore that further. Thanks, Shelly. We're now entering into the Q&A session for today. And typically this week we've been trying to run a little more of an informal session. So I truly invite all of our speakers to ask a question of your co-panelists if one comes up. We have questions that have been generated from participants over the last few weeks. So I will start us off, but at any time, if you feel you have a question that would be relevant, you're most welcome to engage that way. For the first question, Michel, if it's okay, I'll start with you. We're very moved by your willingness to share your personal experience and your ability to share from a raw and honest way of your own lived experience being recruited, and also importantly, your experience championing the work of other children and the voices of children. So the first question I would like to share is, can you provide concrete examples of how young people are more meaningfully engaged in driving solutions to the problems that we're seeing today?
Yeah, I was in Kenya last year. No, sorry, 2 years ago. I was at a conference put on by young African youth, and the purpose for it, I was there to speak, of course, about my experience, but I stayed in the background just to see what happens in the continent. What is it? What are the conversations that are being driven by young people on the continent? And I was simply moved and honestly also just completely inspired by some of the works that young people were doing. For example, there was a group of a delegation of East African youth from Kenya as well as Ethiopia, and they were creating a campaign to try and talk to their militaries and their police officers about why they shouldn't shut down their schools. And these are young people. These are people from like secondary school, right? So high school age students. I was astounded just by the amount of courage that that young people were in. They were so eager to be involved. And I think that's one of the challenges. I think whenever we involve these conversations on prevention, we tend to think of it in a very high level sense. We tend to think of it, of course, through our research, our lens, and in that sense. But when you sit down with young people who are the ones that face some of the violence, who are the ones that face the recruitment, etc., they will be able to tell you exactly what they need in order to not end up in the places that they are. And for me, it's a very simple example, but it illustrated, I think, the importance of what I think all the different panelists, I think, raised up, and of course that has been raised up throughout the last few days, the engagement of young people in creating solutions for their specific issue. And I think that, and the reason why I'm also hesitant to give just a broad example is because all cases are so different, and so all cases require different tactics, different ways of engaging. And I think one of the challenges with the DDR program was exactly that, right? It was proposing a one-size-fits solution to a solution that needs so many different, to an issue that needs so many different solutions. And so I think that that was just one example, I think, of a young people being engaged. The other one I worked for 5 years. I worked with an NGO that was specifically engaging with young people, and I traveled across the U.S. as you raised up in the introduction with Oprah's Ambassadors program, and we were traveling in the United States to under-resourced schools, and these are schools that had no money. That some of the schools had no books, literally in their libraries, and we're going there trying to encourage them, want to be involved within their communities, to talk about the Millennium Development Goals at that time, what they were called. And just hearing the fact that young people, especially in the United States, and these are Black students of color majorly, and how much they also had the solutions for the issues that they were facing, which was gang related, but again goes back to the broad of recruitment of children into violence. And they had the solutions for their community because they faced the gang members who came to them all the time. But whenever you ask them, like, has anybody ever asked you what they can do to help you? None. Right? It's always the government will throw money at an organization, or throw money at a consultant, but yet the young people who face these issues are never there. And so part of my role and my job when I was doing was actually sitting down and coming up with solutions and action plans that they can take after I leave, for them to be engaged more in their communities. And so that, I think that for me, again, reinforced and reinforced the need for youth engagement in coming up with these solutions.
Thank you, Michel. This is a sentiment and a very strong message that our youth speakers have been sharing throughout the week. And that's that young people are not asked. They're not asked to participate, not in a meaningful way. And that as adults, we're not doing enough to listen. And so I really appreciate that perspective. And we have a lot to learn from young people. I think young people's minds haven't been shaped to think so pessimistically yet. There's still a creativity and an innovation that adults seem to lose over time. And we really need to learn from that innovative youth lens, that maybe we could be doing things very differently if we listened better. My second question, I would like to ask Abdikarim. I was wondering if you could speak to us about what are the most important vulnerabilities that you see for young people engaging in violence and armed conflict? How do we address these vulnerability factors differently, and what do you see working in your everyday work?
Thank you so much. And I think I've learned a lot hearing the Institute's executive director and quite alarmingly what Sergey has also said in our context. And I think they are based on facts as bad as they sound. Speaking on the issue of vulnerability, I think there's a lot of multifaceted vulnerability that is surrounding post-conflict environments like Somalia here. But the issue of economic vulnerability and social vulnerability, also including emotional vulnerability, are the biggest factors that are associated with the children being used for their vulnerability. When you have a family that is living on below $1 per day, a father who is unemployed, a mother who is struggling to find a means, and a large family that's composing of more than 7 to 8 children, you tend to wonder what's next. And it is at this point where children become heads of family, or they try to find means at least to provide to the family. And at this moments where recruitment cells, take such vulnerability and entice such children, with a better economical means and such, and force them or, entice them to join into the group. And once they join, I've talked to so many children, and it's never true of what they say. They never provided with any salary. They're not given anything. And, it becomes 5 years, 6 years, and they're never given the chance to visit their family or even talk to their family. They're not given access to, phones or anything to call their parent. And you find that, you know, they couldn't even contribute, they couldn't talk to their family, let alone contribute to their thing. We have also weak family dynamics, you know, parent divorce, lack of education, lack of, you know, economical factors for the parent. All these things also remain vulnerable. You know, we also live in an environment, as Sergei has said, that are susceptible to shocks, floods, droughts, famines. I think you've seen quite in the media, the hunger and the food insecurity in Somalia is quite like. We have every year children dying of hunger, and it is this endemic environmental challenge that force, you know, parents to move or migrate. And at this point, you know, through their migration, it's hard to keep track of the children that are getting lost and are falling in the hands of these armed groups. Structural poverty is also a very big factor in Somalia's vulnerability, where children, you know, they don't have independency, they lack skills, they lack education, and as such, this poverty oftentimes push them to recruitment cells. We don't have institutions that are credible and that are committed to providing social amenities, and as such, if there is no entity that is to provide you with the necessary, you know, like in Canada, if a child is born, he owes to the state so many things, including education, including, you know, means of survival. There are no such institutions here. So if one of your parents or both of your parents are also falling in the poverty circle, then what is it that is open for you? And that's what most of my panelists have mentioned, that push so many. What will work in this context is there's no one solution or one coin fits all. But I think focusing more on preventive measures rather than hard security is a solution. Because if you pour so many money into fighting the children who are forced to take guns, then the 20 children that you will kill in this battle, 40 of them will join in. And that's what is missing. We find the drones, you know, targeting schools, the US drones who are targeting, you know, schools, children who are studying. And that sentiment itself is being used to radicalize more, to join into the group. And I think focusing more on prevention and community structures is the only solution to preventing such, and building the institutions of Somalia to provide the necessary amenities is also very important. Thank you.
Thanks, Abdikarim. It's interesting. I'll just speak from a Canadian perspective for a moment. But right now we're in a large discussion about transitions with our policing service, and the discussion is about funding and funding priorities, and how do we move funding from a response mechanism to more preventative work. And so these conversations that you're raising about where we prioritize our resources is really, it's ringing true from corner to corner to corner of our globe, and we have lots to discuss and learn. It's really interesting that you're talking about sort of the conditions in the community, because also Serge was speaking about the conditions for peace, and what does positive peace look like? What does a peaceful community look like? What are the structures and systems in place? And Serge, you talked about the interconnections between child protection, recruitment, and sustainable peace. And I was wondering if you, based on your research and the indicators, what is your research indicating that we need to move towards differently to ensure that recruitment is reduced or prevented?
Thank you very much for the question. I would say I already introduced it during my presentation. If your levels of positive peace are going up, the resilience of your country is going up, peacefulness, the happiness, the well-being is going up. So just to maybe use a couple of examples, you know, I spoke about those 8 pillars of positive peace. For example, if you would improve business environment, so sound business environment is one of those pillars. Alongside with improvement in human capital, we might see an increase of secondary school attendance and more robust business sectors also able to create employment opportunities and also foster trade. So basically also increase the GDP and have larger percentages of GDP reinvested in positive peace and in something that is positive for your economy. We will also see that poverty, and Abdikarim spoke about this. Children stop school way too early because of this poverty gap, and they need to do something else in their life. So basically, their childhood is taken away because of poverty, because of violence, because of what's happening there. So clearly, we need to invest there into more human capital and creating more just, equitable and inclusive societies. That's at the heart of positive peace. What you need to do is install a virtual circle. So making sure that the potential grievances, and I was really struck by what Abdikarim was saying, because of course at a completely different level, that is exactly what is happening here in Brussels, exactly what is happening in Western cities when it comes to radicalization of youth into jihadist movements or into terrorist movements. The principle of radicalization, the principle of recruitment is exactly the same. Is being alienated from the society in which you live, is being, and the example of, you know, becoming as a young person, becoming the head of the representative of your family, exactly the same here. So I was really struck by this, to see that there is a complete parallelism between recruitment, of course, in conflict-affected areas, but also recruited in societies like the Belgian society, the French, or the British, or the American society. It's exactly the same. And it's, you know, what you need to do is create these virtual circles, making sure that the level of grievances is going down. This is going to lead to less, I would say, demonstrations or use of violence. You will be able to settle those grievances, to settle those demonstrations with more negotiation, less violence. And if you do so, you do need to invest your money into countering violence, so you can invest it in more projects of positive peace. I think that's what you need. That's what you need to do. Make sure that the peace that you create is sustainable, and the only way to do so is by connecting the 8 pillars of positive peace and creating better societies, more resilient societies, justice, equality, equitability, but also inclusion. That's, I would say, that's the recipe. And of course, coming from me, it might seem as, you know, a dream that we should try to achieve every year, but as Shelly has said, we should start working on it, and we should start to make sure that the investments are made to create those societies, and we can discuss more about this in the next question, and see the conditions to be able to create a more peaceful world are really there. In the past decade, we have seen a decrease in peacefulness by 2.5% globally, driven by conflict. And I would say that the tendency for the coming time, through different factors influencing peace and security, is not going. We are not going to change this tendency. And COVID-19 is basically putting a magnifying glass on, I would say, the grievances that led to this increase in conflict, decrease in peacefulness, but also in the increase of potential radicalization. When you look at population growth, especially in Africa, where 17 countries are going to double, or for some of them, like Niger, for example, almost triple their population in the next 30 years, with a socio-economic organization that is not really recognizing youth as part, I would say, as a complete part of society. And you spoke about it, Catherine. We need to listen to the youth. In my office in Brussels, I'm surrounded by youth that is very innovative, that is coming with the right ideas, and maybe new and fresh ideas. We need to listen to them. Experience sometimes comes with the years, but for the youth, listen to them. They also have experience, and they also have important and very sound things to say. And invest in positive peace. That's what you need to do, create more strong and resilient societies. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Serge. And actually, we worked in the Delaire Institute. We've worked before with a professor here at Dalhousie, Dr. Michael Ungar, who looks at resilience. And what's so interesting about his work is that resilience is about this. It's this community setting. It's the systems. It's the larger than the individual structure. So someone's resilience isn't dependent on them as an individual. So there's no deficit in an individual. It's about what we do as a community to hold each other up. And I think if we're talking about prevention and creating positive peace, we have to move past the individual deficit look and look at, as collectively, what are we doing or not doing to enable children to be safe and secure and developing and contributing fully. So I appreciate that. Shelly, I was curious, we're talking a lot about community-based programming, training, education. Serge is talking about economics, and Michel has talked about economics and sort of the priorities of how we're spending our money and our time. I'm curious from your perspective, from a political will. So we've heard over and over this week that we have the frameworks, we have the laws, we have the foundations to know what protection should look like. What would you say to leaders today about how we can act on those frameworks in a more preventative and effective way?
Thanks, Catherine. I think that some of the points have been touched upon a little bit by, especially Michel's points in his first intervention, where he was talking about where we prioritize, where we spend money. And then when Serge was also referencing, the cost of violence versus that 1% that is what we give to aid. I don't think that many people really sit down and do that math to understand exactly how much inequality exists in terms of our prioritization. I would say to governments that are listening that what they need to start to do is to look at how they develop their budgets. How do they develop their plans? Where do they put the most emphasis and resources on? And are they doing it at any point of that decision-making phase, thinking through how it will be something that will positively impact children and their development and future generations? And I would challenge any government who has actually done that to come forth and say, we'd love to see an example of where that exists. But I have yet to see it myself, our own government included. There are times when we think something is expensive to put money towards, and I would question, well, if it is, why do we then put, 20 times more money on something else that is the polar opposite of this positive potential? So I think, thinking through that from a political will perspective, I think also this is where the involvement of children and youth in the political process needs to be stronger. So we always hear about how young people are not out and voting, or they're not part of that process, and therefore they're not a stakeholder oftentimes in the consideration of those who are running for power. I'm putting out there, as I always do when I speak with younger people, is to really encourage you to get out there and do that. Right here in our city right now, we have a young person who's running for mayor, and I looked at some of the points that he has made, and I said, those are brilliant points, and we should all read and listen and take that into real consideration. And for too often, Serge talked about adults being jaded. We are jaded, and we need to listen to young people more, but we also need to give moments to allow not only the listening, but the implementation of some of their actions. And if I reference some of our young participants over the last couple of weeks, when Mira was talking about being willing to fail and do it gracefully, we need to stop being afraid that because we would do something differently, it would cause failure. What we are doing right now isn't working. So what's the problem with us readdressing and reordering the way that we currently do politics? Thanks, Catherine.
That's great. Our youth speakers have had very, very powerful insights, and I know that we're eager to look back and think through some of these statements to make sure that their conversations are shared even more broadly, because there's rich thinking to do after this week. Right now, I have many more questions I'd like to ask, but I'd like to offer, if there are any of our speakers who had a real strong question they were waiting to pose to a colleague today. I'll give you a moment to think about if there's a question you would like to ask.
I have one, Catherine, if you would allow me. All right. And I would like to ask a question to my two colleagues on the panel, I would say Michel and Abdikarim. and it's about the gender dynamics of child recruitment. I mean, I've been talking about inclusion. I've been talking about equal distribution of resources, about, I would say, development of human capital. But I can imagine that there are different types of recruitment when it comes to boys or to girls that are getting recruited by armed groups too. I mean, do you have experience in this, and how is this evolving, and what can we do to make sure that there is also improvement in that case? Thank you.
Yeah, for me, I guess in the case of there are two sort of answers to this. One would be in the Congo. From my experience in the Congo, I think one of the biggest challenges that's there, I think it goes across borders, and Abdikarim Abdikarim said it as well, and it's the challenge of the economic challenge of despair. The opportunities that are not there for people, especially young people, in a continent that's majorly, I think there was a stat, I think it was in 2012 when they did the census, and about 65% of the population was below the age, it was basically 15 and under. I don't know if that was right, but I saw that stat somewhere and it shocked me. And if that's the case, then I imagine the amount of young people that are growing up in the Congo, even when I do call, because I do still have families, and you just call and you hear the conversations that are happening for young people, and the despair that they feel, that there's no social mobility for them, right? That the impact is like the social mobility so locked in. If your dad or somebody within your family works in this in a government position, that means you will never get there, even if you're capable, even if you're qualified. And so I imagine that for people that's in the city. Now, if you go into the larger rural parts, which is where most of the young people are recruited from into the military, imagine the despair that they feel and the violence that they face. Especially the last couple of months in the northeast part of Congo, where women have been raped and chopped and killed. And it's because none of their grievances are being answered to, right? None of the grievances are being answered to. So young people feel like they have to pick up arms to go and protect themselves, men and women. So imagine if girls are being raped at such a high rate, they will have to answer back in some way. And if somebody poses them or gives them an idea that, my group is going to make sure that you're protected, they'll join it. And so I think the recruitment of both in the gendered sense is that I think it fits both ways. It's because they're recruited because there's social grievances that are not being answered to, right? And of course the dynamics are different for the girls and boys, but even for the girls, it's the same, at least in my experience from the Congo. And it's sad that that's the case. But I'm also noticing that here in North America, and I think we also have to be very aware that it's a dynamic that's even happening here with white supremacists online, that girls and boys are being exposed to different types of ideas and radicalizations here too. I imagine the shooter that killed the people in New Zealand in the mosque. They highlighted one of the manifestos. In the manifesto, he highlighted one of the people that basically influenced his ideology was a young woman from Canada. And so like all these things are happening, I think, at the same time, while maybe different for the genders. I think it's the social grievances that all genders are facing that are pushing young people into being recruited into these places.
Thank you. I think my friend has quite elaborated on this. The issue of gender and armed conflict in Somalia, first of all, there's no concrete data, and no one has yet to do extensive research in this area. But within our programming, we do have women and girls who have been forcibly recruited, not necessarily to take up arms and as a combatant, but to provide different roles within the hierarchy of the group. So they're forced into marriage, they're forced to spy, some of them are forced to carry weapons, concealed weapon. In a recent attack in a very heavily fortified and well-guarded buildings in Mogadishu's administrative, where the mayor was seriously injured and consequently died for those injuries. A lady who was working there between the age of less than 20 was given a concealed jacket to carry that eventually caused more harm. So they do have roles, and in a context like this where gender-based violence is quite subversive and a lot, there is what we perceive as male-dominated roles and women-dominated or girls-dominated roles, and violence that is more on gender is quite a lot. We have gender-based violences that's quite prevalent, intimate partner violence. So girls are recruited, and when she or he, she becomes impregnated and forced into marriage, which mostly, someone has to consent to marriage, Islamically speaking. And if that doesn't happen, then the society perceives such child as a bastard. So eventually, when they leave such hierarchies, they are stigmatized, and eventually, most of them, when they come to us, they come with a very mental issues, traumas, and stress that is so offensive that some of them sink with the tendencies of suicide. And I think what needs to be done is, first of all, have concrete data and programming, in terms of programming, have the needs of girls that need to be assessed, because boys and girls have different needs when it comes to the programming of the services that we provide. And I'll conclude by saying that girls are also very much affected by the conflict, because at very young age they are forced to see the consequences of the conflict, and oftentimes boys will join into armed force because their sisters have been raped, their mothers have been this and that, and it plays a very big role in the recruitment of and the use of children. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments, Michel and Abdikarim, and Serge, for the great question. We spent yesterday talking about the gender dynamics of recruitment and use, and so bringing that to this discussion is very important, and I really appreciate the question. We were talking quite a bit yesterday about the lack of children's voices as we continue to talk today. What we talked about yesterday, though, was the lack of girls' voices, and that compounded inequality that girls and gender minorities face. So it's a really important question when we're thinking about prevention and how we're designing prevention and who is designing prevention, because it's often not from a gender equitable position. So that's an excellent question. Shelly, I was wondering if you wanted to add any comments to that.
Yeah, I do want to address some points, because what we have seen in some research reports that are related to whether it's the context of radicalization in Western contexts like Canada, or whether it's in places like Nigeria, as an example, and the connections to recruitment, use, and armed conflict. Actually, there's a few things that are really important for us to understand. It's that all young people are searching for purpose, they're searching for meaning, and they're searching for access to power. And what we see right now is a deficit of that for many young people, and COVID will now only exacerbate that because of our inability to see beyond tomorrow. So for many of us, the kind of stress levels that exist in the world are exacerbated by not knowing what will things be like in a month, let alone 10 years time. And so it is important to understand that. And I just wanted to highlight, though, that from a gendered perspective, that will also be very different. And that's the different lens that different genders would have on the perceptions of what that means, what your meaning is, what your purpose is, and how you get access to power. So some of the discussions yesterday, yeah, are really, really important to think about here. But I would also just want to highlight here that it's not just boys and girls. It's about the way that some of the tools and the tactics like sexual violence are used, which are negative on both boys and girls and on communities. So, you know, boys who are recruited and used, who might be used to commit sexual violence, is not something we talk about very often. But if that is your first sexual experience, is committing rape against your own family, I can't imagine what that does in terms of your perceptions of gender relations. I know we've spoken with boys in places like Colombia who talk about, you know, forced abortion of girls who they've been in relationships with because the relationships were viewed as taboo within the FARC. And then the girls being forced to have an abortion, and the boys saying nobody asked us anything about how we feel and the impact that that has on us. So there's a whole host of dynamics we're not even considering in this conversation that has so much more importance for us to understand in terms of the breakdown of communities and of how do we create loving, caring societies, places where we can talk and share when those very, very basic elements are you know, broken down with young people. So I just wanted to add that it's more to it just than about why boys or girls would join. It's also about all of the impacts of the way that they are used and what this means for their long-term hopes and dreams.
Thank you, Shelly. That's very important. We're getting close to the end of our session. I'll just have one final question and invite our panelists to all contribute maybe a shorter response. So all four of you have an opportunity to share. Given the current context in COVID with rising and changing dynamics of how children are engaged in violence and competing human rights and economic policies, how do we prioritize prevention? How do we share prevention strategies that are effective? And how do we encourage, from an economic perspective, prevention work to be prioritized, given it's harder to measure impact? It's harder to demonstrate in that short duration that exists in sort of the development world around the use of grant or the distribution of funding. So I'm open to whomever. Michel, it looked like maybe you were ready to respond first, so maybe we'll try Michel first.
I was just looking at sort of like points that I could. I'll just highlight. I think just one point. I think with COVID, I think Shelly put it quite well actually, and the impact that COVID is going to have on a lot of these challenges. I think something that both Serge and I were talking about, which is with regards to funding, and the important part of I think the conversation that lacks is we always fail to tell the world the cost of not doing anything, right? We always talk about how much it's going to cost to fix this problem. We don't talk enough about the cost of not doing something. And I think this is the problem. This is the shift that needs to happen with how we view a lot of these challenges. And because I live here in Canada, and I've lived here for the majority of most of my life, and I've traveled to a lot of Western countries, and there are a lot of competing ideologies. When you look at it in the States, whether the conservatives is the middle view, and then you have the left-leaning views, and all of them have very competing ideas of what the world looks like. And I tend to say that Western societies tend to be very conservative leaning. They're very center right leaning, most Western countries. And so people's thoughts in general, when we talk about humanitarianism, is always centered around, well, why are we helping these people? Why can't they help themselves, right? And this sort of pervades into, I see almost it pervades into government policy. We're always responding to that question, why can't they help themselves, rather than us actually responding to, if we don't help, or if we don't do anything about it, it's going to cost us more as a world to not do anything about it, right? And I think if you frame your conversation from that perspective, it just triggers people to actually think differently about this conversation, because I think for a very long time, humanitarianism has always been seen as this sort of like handout, right? It's been seen as through the lens of charity. Well, this is not about charity. This is about our security as a world. You know, when we talk about whether it's gender, whether it comes to climate change, all of these things these are very serious issues, of course. They're very challenging. They're not easy, as you just said. You can't really quantify them. It's not easy to quantify them, but they're incredibly important because, you know, I think Serge did highlight, I think, a $14 trillion, I think he said, that it costs the world to just violence costs the world. So imagine all of that. It's unreal. So I think that's my perspective on that.
Okay, thank you. Serge, how about we hear from you next?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. I think COVID-19 is putting a magnifying glass on all the socioeconomic grievances that led to this decrease in peacefulness, but also led to a steep increase in civil unrest in the past 10 years. Those social grievances have not been addressed in the past 10 years. And with both the lockdown periods in many countries, but also with the incredible economic crisis that we will go through in the coming weeks and months, I think this is only going to be aggravated by COVID-19. We expect to see all our indicators, both for negative peace, but also for positive peace, to go down in the next months and years. So that's very negative. We also expect that the budgets, you know, a lot of money is pumped into the world economy, the national and regional economies at this moment. So there will be less budget for overseas development aid, which I think is a huge mistake, personally, but also within the Institute for Economics and Peace. We also see a world that is shifting from a collaborative approach in a more liberal approach to international relations and in a multilateral approach into competition. So this is not positive for peace development. Last week I was in a webinar with Ramayad, former French state secretary, who said that in international relations or in the international debate at the moment, peace is not a topic, none at all. And then I think the last thing that I would like to say also is to, when decisions are made, like about the future of humanity, because that's what we need to think about. When when decisions are made about future of humanity, like this idea that we have today to go green and digital, that would be the solution for the 30 years in the future. We need to realize the impact that such decision can also have on peace and security. If we want to go green and digital today, which I think in some form is a solution or way forward, we need to understand that we are going to consume incredible amounts of rare metals, rare earth, that are in the earth, in the same locations where conflicts are today, and where large ecological ecosystems that we need to survive as humanity are also located. And what is really disturbing me is to see that in those zones, when you have the resources, both for climate and both for, I would say, green and digital in the future, you also see the emergence of autocratic and authoritarian regimes in the same places. So I would say, sorry for giving like a more negative conclusion to my presentation or participation in this panel, but when you look at the indicators and when you look at what is happening in our societies, especially in the international society today, I won't say that the indicators are really positive. So I think, as Shelly has said, I thought that this was like an incredible approach. We need to start invest, and we need to individually, we need to start investing in a better future and in more strong, resilient, equitable and inclusive societies. And with people like Michel and Abdikarim, but everybody on this panel, and I would say everybody that is participating today in this webinar, if we all start today to do something for our future, but especially for the future of humanity, we will get there someday. And as Michel has said, go vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Serge. That you're raising so many important points, and I hope people do look at the Global Peace Index and see how we're tracking and measuring peacefulness and how we can do better generally in peace and security. Abdikarim, your thoughts?
Thank you, Catherine. And I think my two co-panelists have already exhausted all the possible answers I could have provided. But nevertheless, I think in the face of a common enemy, such as COVID-19, I think we should prioritize our engagement in the way we prevent child recruitment. And I think the first thing that will come into my mind is holding accountability to its core and providing, justice and strengthening the enforcement mechanism within national and state level will better protect children from armed conflict. And I think since we don't have a lot of resources, to power our war machines and our soldiers, and we are more focused on protecting soldiers than civilians. And since that resources are depleted by COVID-19, I think we should have time to engage with the non-state actors who are, at the forefront of recruiting children, and sit with them at least in a platform and, lay out the possibility that they should not recruit children. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abdikarim, and for all of the work that you're doing with the Elman Center. Shelly, any final thoughts on prevention? How do we prioritize and better fund prevention?
I'll try to be quick, Catherine. I think COVID can be viewed as a negativity, but it can be viewed as a moment where we understand how interconnected the world has been. So let's use this moment to think about the ways that we can continue that in a positive fashion. So we know we can't solve a pandemic if the whole world isn't a part of the solution. So view this as a moment to think about that. And also money. I mean, if I think that issue of resources, I can't speak for all of the nations, but if I think about Canada and the kind of debates we've had in this country about what money we spend on to address COVID and those who are out of work, etc., it seems ludicrous to me that we are so worried about that investment. And yet, at the same time, we have to recognize that we have got to solve it in our approaches if we are going to get to all of the other things. So if you look to our neighbors to the south, and if the issue is always on, if we do these measures, it's going to cause economic collapse. Well, then if that's the case, the system is broken, because we need to address why we're in that situation where we would think it's better to risk people's safety and security for economic gains. So I think some of these things, these failures, we've got to understand them, because that's driving at the heart of this greed and grievance dynamic and the recruitment that comes with that when it comes to children. But on a positive note, if we can think of the environmental movement and what COVID has done in a very positive way for the environmental movement, let's also think about this as a moment to have some positive approaches about putting children at the top of the peace and security agenda. And so all of the negativities that Serge had laid out, I'm helping him to put the positive into their positive piece, okay? And that's by focusing on children. Thank you.
Thanks, Shelly. So I can't thank you all enough on behalf of the Dallaire Institute. We just want to extend our sincere thanks for your willingness to share your experience and expertise with us today. It's clear you're passionate about what you're doing, and we're very fortunate to work with you and hopefully to continue to work with you to improve this work together. I'd like to thank again our funder, Bruce McKean, for your generous support of this Knowledge for Prevention project, and to the Government of Canada for continuing to champion children's rights with us. I want to draw your attention to the fact that we still have one more session tomorrow. So tomorrow is the final day of our online symposium. Tomorrow we will be focusing on early warning to early action. How do we do this work earlier, better, with more impact? And we will be joined by incredible global champions. For example, we have Dr. Siobhan O'Neill coming from the university, the UN University, Dr. Walter Sama, Head of Mission Analysis for the African Union Mission in Somalia, Lieutenant Colonel Lusan Ingabiri, who is the Military Gender Advisor at the United Nations Department of Peace Operations, and again, another outstanding youth speaker, Akleke Christian Leki, who is the National Coordinator of the Local Youth Corner in Cameroon. So we would also like to take this opportunity to invite you to join our community of practice. We are endeavoring to bring together more practitioners and researchers and communities together to share strategies for prevention, to share lessons learned, to move this work further. If you're interested in learning more about the community of practice, my colleagues will be reaching out to participants to invite you to join, and we sure hope that you do. So once again, we'd like to thank you very much for joining us today, and a sincere thanks to the panelists for sharing your wise words of wisdom and your passion for this work. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow for Early Warning to Early Action. Take care.